Good evening, everyone. This is Rashmi from Great HR and today's moderator of this session. I welcome you all to our today's 28th expert webinar session, Parichay. And as you all know, the topic for today is all you need to know about PoSH compliances. So I'm sure a lot of you are curious to know more about the compliance because PoSH, it is one of the important aspect in any organization, right? So in our session today, we are going to talk a lot about it, and also you can ask questions to our experts today in our session. But before I begin with this session, let's do a little bit of housekeeping on how the session goes on. So first few minutes, we'll be asking few questions on your behalf to our expert speakers today in the session. That will be the first part of the session. And in the second session, the time is all yours, I can say, because that's when you can start putting across your questions and our experts will be more than happy to answer your questions. All right. And also currently the session is being recorded. So if any of your teammates happen to miss out on our session today or due to some unforeseen circumstances, if you happen to miss out on any part of our today's session, do not worry, sit back, relax, because the recorded session will be shared with all of you soon once the session is done. All right. So on this note, let's begin our today's session then. So to talk to you about our today's topic, for any person to grow and be successful in what they are doing, their environment plays an essential role. Right? So it is imperative that they feel safe, be it at their homes, schools, universities, or workplaces. For an individual to grow and deliver their best, the environment matters a lot. So in our today's session, we are going to talk at length about creating a safe work environment by implementing PoSH compliances. The Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act 2013 is legislative act in India that seeks to protect women from sexual harassment at their place of work. This is popularly known as the PoSH Act. So any organization should have a clear understanding of this act in order to make the workplace more inclusive and secure for all employees. But the questions are employees aware of this? Or how can employers implement this? How can it contribute to the company's culture? What is an internal committee? Or is it something like what is the role of HR leaders in building a safe workplace? So I'm sure these are very few questions all of us have. In fact, there will be a lot more questions about this in our mind today, right? So we do understand your concerns. So in the next 1 hour, we are going to discuss this in detail with our esteemed panelists today, Dr. Ishani Roy and Ms. Chryslynn DeCosta, who are co-founders of Serein Inc. and also our PoSH partners, and understand from them everything about the PoSH compliances. But before that, let me tell you more about our today's speakers. So to start with, I would like to introduce Dr. Ishani Roy, founder, Serein Inc. to all of you. So to tell you more about Ishani Roy, she's a scientist by training, and Ishani has a PhD in applied mathematics from Brown University, and her dissertation was on developing mathematical models to solve astrophysics problems. And also Ishani has been a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford and King's College London, where she worked on biomathematics. And most recently, she was a research scientist with General Electric, where she contributed to product development in the aerospace, healthcare, and energy sector. During the course of her work, she became interested in how some companies were successful in growing an innovative and diverse culture while many others struggled. So Serein is an attempt at using science to enable diversity and inclusion and drive organizational development in every business in India. So Dr. Ishani, we are delighted to have you in our session today. Welcome again.
Thank you so much, Rashmi. Thank you. We are really happy to be here together as well.
Wonderful. And dear attendees, here is our next expert speaker of this session, Ms. Chryslynn DeCosta. So Ms. Chryslynn DeCosta is the co-founder and head of research at Serein Inc. And also to tell you a little bit about Chryslyn's background, it's like a huge, I can say, but I'll try to put it across in whatever way possible. So Ms. Chryslynn, after studying economics at St. Xavier's College in Mumbai, she has joined the Gandhi Fellowship Program in Rajasthan that addresses educational leadership in rural government schools. She graduated from Azim Premji University in Bangalore with a master's in education. Her work at APU and in Rajasthan strengthened her interest and expertise on leadership, gender, diversity, and inclusion. So it has led her to understand the nuances of organizational culture and the workings of diverse teams. Chryslynn serves as an external member to 50 plus companies internal committee, that is IC, in fact, including us, the Creative Software, Piramal Pharma, Kraft Heinz, Rocketium, Spotify, and many others. So, Ms. Chryslynn, it's a pleasure to have you here. Once again, welcome to this session.
Thank you, Rashmi. I'm looking forward to the session.
All right, so dear attendees, this was about our expert speakers today. Now, moving on to the next part of our session, we will be starting off with a few questions in order to gain understanding on what exactly is this PoSH compliance, how is it going to help our organization. All right, so Dr. Ishani, my first question is to you. We all have heard of PoSH, but not a lot of us are aware of the gamut of the act. So what are 5 basics that you would like to inform our audience about today?
Thank you so much. This is a very useful question because it talks about how do you practically go about, implementing the PoSH law, even if you are a small company, for example. So the law is actually being made very simple. When it was first put forth in 2013, the judicial system recognized that a lot of companies would be doing it for the first time. So to make it simple, not only for the implementation part, but also for people to, have a way to report if they face with any uncomfortable situation. What it is done is that it's broken down into 3 different aspects. One is a policy, organizational policies. So first thing that the law says is have a policy in place so that people who are inside the organization or even visiting you or working with you as a third party, they all know that you are compliant under this law. Secondly, what it says is that in that policy, make sure you put in the fact that you have an internal committee. So the law recognized that for any sexual harassment, going to the court and filing, for example, a police report is not going to be easy, right? If you faced with a verbal sexual harassment, how likely are you going to go to the court? So what they said is, let's have an internal mechanism, an internal committee, for example, which will look at cases of sexual harassment, whether it's physical harassment and very serious, whether it's verbal harassment and you still consider it very serious, whichever type it might be, the internal committee should be looking at it. So first comes the organizational policy part and creating their internal committee. The second part, the mandate number 3 and 4, are making sure people know what that is. So there would be the awareness. So employees should know that if they face with something uncomfortable, whether it falls under sexual harassment or not, that is an awareness that needs to be done. Right? And the second awareness session, or a little bit of an intense training session that needs to happen, is for those internal committee members. So if they are required to look at a case of sexual harassment, whether it's a physical harassment or a verbal harassment, uncomfortable joke, or whether it's somebody feeling uncomfortable because they are being stared at, whichever might be the case, if it falls under sexual harassment, the IC need to take a look at it. And what they need to do is do an inquiry and suggest some disciplinary action. So the IC needs to be trained on the law, and IC needs to know what to do when a case of sexual harassment comes up. So the third and the fourth mandate are those awareness sessions for the IC as well as for the employees. The fifth one is for the government to know that whether you're compliant or not. So what they do is they have identified the district officer. The district officer can be, say, for example, your magistrate. District officers typically in cities are district there is an actually special office for district officers. So different cities have different authorities who are called district officers. So you need to file a annual report to the district officer wherever, whichever location you're registered at. So these are the 5 mandates of the law, and they're broken down really well in terms of organization policies, in terms of awareness trainings, and in terms of making sure the government knows that you are compliant.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Ishani. I think you have given a wonderful opening to this discussion. So my next question is for Ms. Chryslynn. So Ms. Chryslynn, like Dr. Ishani was mentioning, yes, it's all about safeguarding your employees, I can say, right? So my question to you is, the Act protects only female employees from sexual harassment in the workplace, or how can we extend this protection to all employees in the organization?
You are right, Rashmi. The Act specifically protects female employees from sexual harassment from a male employee. So that is the understanding of in the Act. However, so all the partners that we work with, all our 300 partners have written gender neutral company policies. Now, there are a couple of things a company can do to extend protection to all employees. One is the policy that Ishani mentioned. You write your company policy in accordance to the Act, but you specify that it is a gender neutral company policy. This means that male, female, and transgender employees are within their rights to reach out to the company's internal committee. So that's the first. The second is to ensure that when you are appointing these internal committee members, they have a broader understanding of gender, because when you have a gender neutral company policy, some of your cases might be a little complicated. It's easy to understand a case of sexual harassment towards a female employee, but sometimes maybe if a male employee files a complaint, you might feel that this is not really sexual harassment, this may be unprofessional behavior, right? So how do you recognize that yes, it is possible for a transgender employee or a male employee to experience sexual harassment? And for that, it's important who you choose as your committee members. The last, of course, is the trainings that Ishani mentioned. If your internal committee is trained on a regular basis, it will allow them to be unbiased, which means that not only do you have a gender neutral company policy, it is actually accessible to employees of all genders in your organization. So these are the 3 best practices we've seen when companies choose to implement a gender neutral company policy.
Wonderful, wonderful knowing that, Chryslynn. Thank you so much for sharing that piece of information. I'll move on to my next question. So Dr. Ishani, my next question is for you. You have mentioned that it is important that every employee is aware of this, right? So my question now is, why is it important to spread awareness about PoSH in particular?
Yes, this is a great question actually. So why not just stop at writing a policy and share it with all your employees? They can read it, and then you have everything in writing. But the awareness is something that is very, very important. As my colleague Chryslynn was saying, it's so important to have a conversation on it, right? Say for example, I'll give you an example. Tomorrow I receive a WhatsApp joke, right, that I find very uncomfortable with. But some of my friends, for example, they have seen that before and they're not that uncomfortable about it, right? And I'm really, in my mind, I'm not quite sure whether I should actually, am I overreacting? Is it something, am I the only person finding uncomfortable? And if something like that keeps happening to WhatsApp, what should I do about it? So what we think, what we realize is that there is a lot of misunderstanding about what constitutes sexual harassment. So a lot of people say, for example, verbal harassment, right? Tomorrow, if I get into a fight in the workplace and I call someone certain names, does that fall into sexual harassment? Do those words have to have a sexual connotation for it to become a sexual harassment? So we often don't know what that is, right? So it's very important to have an open conversation about it. So I can ask my HR, I can ask a practitioner, I can ask a gender expert like Chryslynn, for example, that what should I do when I see something that I'm uncomfortable with, but I'm unsure how to go about it, right? And also, one of the things that Chryslynn mentioned is very important. What are my rights? If, say, for example, I am uncomfortable with a joke, will I be taken seriously? Will people say that, oh no, get on with it, try to take a joke. We are quite used to these jokes, so have a laugh. Are they going to actually say those things, or are they going to take it seriously? So it's very important to know that you have rights, and the rights are that you will be heard if something uncomfortable happens to you, and those what you say to the internal committee stays confidential. Because, say for example, you go to the committee and people start talking about it, it's very unlikely you're going to feel safe in the organization. What you mentioned in the very beginning are two very important words: safety and trust, right? So if they don't take you seriously, it's going to be very difficult for you to have a trust in the organization. That's why we say the awareness part of it is very important. So whatever misconceptions or doubts that I may have in my mind, that I can clarify those things, and I also can know what will happen to me if I actually go and speak to the internal committee.
All right. Thank you so much for answering the question, Dr. Ishani. So while we talk about this, Ms. Chryslynn, you mentioned that the IC members, the internal committee members, have to be regularly trained on this, right? So now my question is around that. So we hear the term IC, that is internal community, whenever we talk about PoSH. So what is this internal committee? Who are all the members of this?
Sure. So Rashmi, actually, India is the only country that has this provision for an internal committee. And largely it is to have a process that is internal, faster, and people feel safe to reach out. So setting up of this internal committee is very important. There are a couple of pointers in the act itself of how to appoint committee members. So for example, the law specifies that more than 50% of your committee has to be women. It is chaired by the senior most woman in the organization. So that is whom we call a presiding officer. And apart from that, there is what is called a minimum quorum of 3 internal committee members. Besides that, the law mandates that there should be 1 external member. And the purpose of this external member is, very often employees say, okay, the purpose of the external member is to have somebody who's fair and unbiased. But over time, you will realize that the purpose of an external member is also to have somebody who is fluent with the law, fluent with the timelines, and has that expertise of dealing with multiple cases across organizations. So the law specifies these particular aspects of setting up the committee. Now, besides that, the internal committee is somebody that is going to be dealing with sensitive information. So when leaders are appointing committee members, it is important that you pick people with maturity, but also people who you trust. This is very sensitive information at the end of the day. Your presiding officer can definitely be somebody who is the senior most woman in the organization, but the rest of the committee members, you can select from across teams, from across different levels of hierarchy. One of the reasons being is that when you have that diversity represented on your committee, more people are likely to feel comfortable to reach out and ask for help. Largely, when somebody faces sexual harassment in a company, they don't send a blanket email to the whole committee. More often than not, they will reach out to a committee member who they are most comfortable with. And when you have such a diverse committee, you're more likely to hear the voices of your employees. The other 2 things about an internal committee I would suggest is to pick people who have the time. It is a very time intensive process when there is a case, but also in general, like Ishani mentioned, every year you have to undergo a training. But also your responsibility is not just cases. Your responsibility is also to make sure that proactively you are building a safe workplace. So to have those conversations, to be part of these quarterly meetings, it is important to pick committee members who not only have good intentions, but also are willing to make that time investment. So I think these are some of the best practices we've seen. And like I mentioned earlier, sort of picking somebody who has a broader understanding of gender, especially if you are a company who has chosen to have a gender neutral company policy.
Sure. Thank you so much, Chryslynn. And Ishani, I'll move to our next question. This is all about what role HRs have got to play in this, right? So my question is, how can HRs proactively build a safe workplace beyond the mandates of the law?
This is actually a very, very good question. And I love this question because in our experience, like Chryslynn mentioned, having worked with over 300 companies, what we have realized is that the HR has a lot of power to make it a safe space, a safe culture. Like we know, the law actually puts the legal onus on the management. So if you are the director of the company, if you don't have a policy, for example, or if you don't do the trainings, if you don't file the annual report, it's the leadership, the management's legal obligation to do so. They can be held accountable. Now, they are the ones who are forming the IC. So the IC is held accountable for looking at cases. They are the ones who need to know what the law is, what is exactly the letter of the law, what are the powers of the law, what kind of disciplinary actions they can suggest, and all of that. But what is HR's role? It is very, very important. What we have seen is for HR to implement all of these things, right? Like Chryslynn mentioned, that picking an IC actually goes a huge, huge way, right? Picking the right people in the IC, like Crystal mentioned, that not only they should be mature about, these are confidential information you're dealing with. These are very sensitive situations you are dealing with. So not only it matters that when you are doing an inquiry, you follow the letter of the law, but you're being empathetic about it. So if, say, for example, someone's going through a tough time, the IC can suggest counseling sessions for them, right? Have somebody take care of them in an emotional health while they're going through the tough time. Now, who can implement all of these things? HR can actually go ahead and do that, right? Their managers can do that, HR can do that. Certain cases of sexual harassment, for example, certain cases of harassment, when it happens, there are a series of events that happen, right? Some cases can be sexual harassment. Say, for example, a sexual joke, a comment which has a sexual connotation. Certain other behavior, for example, extremely aggressive behavior, or somebody who is threatening someone, sometimes there is discrimination which is happening along with the sexual harassment, do not often fall under the IC's purview. So what happens at that time is that IC, out of the 5 different cases of harassment, they will look at the cases which have a sexual connotation to it. But the rest of them, which, say, for example, don't fall under PoSH, they actually don't look at it. What they say is HR will take up this matter. So what then becomes very important is to look at the code of conduct policy, for example, or ethics policy the company has. So in order to have a safe environment, it's very important not only to have a trained IC who looks at cases of PoSH, it's also very important for a trained HR who looks at cases of any behavior that violates the code of conduct, violates ethics, to make a culture which is going to be very safe and secure.
Sure. Thanks for answering the question, Ishani. Chryslynn, in our previous last to last question, I think you have partially answered this question, but if you would like to elaborate this, here is a chance. The question is, what are the best practices when a case is filed?
That's a good question, Rashmi. I'll just add a couple of things. I think Ishani also covered quite a few. When a case is filed, there are 2 things that happen. One is a case doesn't always come in writing. Sometimes a employee might come to an HR or to a IC member who they have some kind of rapport relationship with, or whom they trust, right? And that first response of the person who they are confiding in really matters, whether they choose to take that complaint forward or they choose to back out from the process. So like Ishani mentioned, the most important part in terms of best practices for HR and internal committee members is how do you demonstrate empathy. Now, empathy is not just feeling, like we say, it's a difference between sympathy and empathy, right? Empathy is to say that things like, I thank you for trusting me. I know this is a difficult process, right? Or to tell the person that, how would you like me to help? So one of the things we tell our committee members when we do the training is avoid making overtly positive statements like, don't worry, everything will be fine. Or telling somebody that it's not such a big deal, just ignore it this time, and next time if it gets worse, let me know, right? Remember that if somebody has chosen to file that complaint, it is because they trust you and it has taken them a lot of thinking to decide to formally report it. So that first conversation of empathy really, really matters. A couple of the most important best practice, I would say, when dealing with a case is to ensure that you follow timelines. A lot of thought has gone when this act was written out into what is the way in which you're going to make employees feel safe, right? When somebody files a complaint, they are experiencing a lot of anxiety, and your respondent as well. Imagine if a case is filed against you, you are going to be anxious and unable to concentrate at work. So when a committee follows the timeline, it allows the organization, it allows the two parties to come get a conclusion and have that sense of normalcy back in the workplace. So following timelines that are specified in the law is extremely important. The other two things, of course, is documentation. It is very important for the IC to maintain documentation during a case. This is, of course, in the event that tomorrow, say, a case goes to court after the IC has concluded, or later on, maybe there is a repeat of that behavior and you want to relook at documents or information. It's very important for the IC to maintain proper documentation of case hearings and things like that. And of course, lastly, this is something that is not mentioned in the law, but we've seen this to be very useful. Keep both the parties constantly updated. As committee members, you have your everyday jobs, right? So it's not possible to only focus on the case. So there are going to be days when you're not going to be able to conduct an inquiry, you're going to have to postpone it to the next week or things like that. But keep the complainant and the respondent constantly updated on the timelines so that they do not feel like you have forgotten about the case or that you have closed the case without them knowing. These are situations when a case goes public. So to avoid things like that, ensure that both parties are constantly updated.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you so much, Chryslynn. While you are talking about case going public, Dr. Ishani, this actually leads to my next question. So my question is, what are the implications of a case being made public?
This is a very good question. Actually, Rashmi, let me first step back a little bit and talk about when does a case become public and what do we mean by a case becoming public, right? There are two ways it can become public. So first and foremost, remember that if there is a PoSH committee in place, a policy in place, and the management implements the PoSH law correctly, nothing can become public. So the internal committee members, as well as the external member who sits on the IC, is legally liable to maintain confidentiality. So as external members, when we write, say, when we sit as a committee, we actually write our NDA, right? So we are not allowed to talk about any case with anybody, right? So if the PoSH law is implemented and the case comes to the IC, everything stays confidential. When it becomes public is when it goes outside, which means, say, for example, the IC doesn't take up the case properly. The 6 months have passed and the IC still doesn't complete the case and complete an inquiry report. Or, for example, the management doesn't take the disciplinary action the IC has recommended. In any of these scenarios, the complainant can actually go and file a complaint outside under the judicial system. That is when it can actually become public, right? The media houses can pick it up, for example, and things actually can become public. Second way it can become public is where we had seen earlier is that, say, for example, a person is constantly facing harassment and they are going to the committee or going to the management, but it's not being taken up, right? Either they don't have a policy or they don't have a committee. For certain reason, it's hushed up. right? That is when what we have noticed, if people may write on social media, for example, right? They don't have a channel to get the justice for something that has happened to them. So they may write on social media, so which can also become public. Now, these are the different scenarios when it happens, when a case becomes public. Now, these have a lot of implications on the individual as well as the organization. First and foremost, think about the implication on the complainant themselves. If a case becomes public, if somebody breaks a confidentiality, for example, it can be a respondent, the perpetrator, it can be a friend of the perpetrator, it can be anybody breaking confidentiality. But if that becomes public, it's very, very difficult for the complainant to actually get any justice for what has happened to them. It is also emotionally very, very traumatic, right? First of all, it's a very sensitive thing. A traumatic experience has happened when they faced with sexual harassment. Now, when people start talking about it or gossiping about it, it's very unlikely they're going to have any sort of mental peace. So what we have noticed is that if confidentiality is broken, things go outside, if people gossip about it, it's very unlikely the complainant will feel safe and secure in the organization. They're most likely to leave. And often the trauma is so high that they think twice before taking up another opportunity. They actually a lot of times decide that it's not worth for me to be in the workplace which doesn't support me or give me the basic psychological safety. So it's very traumatic for the complainant. I would also like to talk about the perpetrator, right? If a case becomes public, um, for if a case becomes public out of a if a confidentiality is broken, that is not correct towards the perpetrator either, because we are not the court of law, right? End of the day, we are members of the community. So we are not the police, we are not the justice system. So it's not our job to make anything public, even towards the witnesses or perpetrator. Their right is also to have their name and everything confidential. So, from the individual's point of view, it's very important that things stay confidential. What is the impact on the organization? The impact is huge. What we have noticed is that if a case becomes public, if, for example, it goes in the media, there is a lot of implication on the organization. People start talking about it in a way that it's not a safe space, that things happen there and it's not taken seriously. We have noticed that there is a huge impact on the recruitment, right? Because things get written in the forum, which is very difficult for the organization to come out of. So one of the learnings from cases which have become public is that have a very strong implementation of the PoSH policy. What we mean by that is that have a policy in place so people know that it's not okay to break confidentiality. If I'm a witness or if I come to know about the case, I'm a manager, I'm a friend, whoever I am, there is a penalty to breaking confidentiality. And second thing, make sure you talk about it in the awareness sessions that you cannot break confidentiality, right? It's going to have an impact on the individual and on the organization.
Sure, Ishani, thank you so much. Also, somewhere you mentioned that the entire system, like we are not the police, we are not the judiciary system. So this actually leads to my next question, and it's for you, Chryslynn. So the question is, why would an employee prefer to file a complaint with the IC rather than going to the police?
That's a good question, Rashmi. In fact, there are cases of which are very severe, like Ishani mentioned at the start, right? Cases of physical sexual assault that are reported to the internal committee where the complainant refuses to file a police complaint. Now, there is a lot of stigma attached, and we need to acknowledge that. When a complaint is filed with the police, the complainant is scared of things like, will my family find out? Will I have the financial ability to continue to pursue the case in court? Or, as you are aware, most cases of sexual harassment do not have witnesses present or a lot of proof. So the fear that how will I prove that I actually experienced sexual harassment? So these are very common questions that a complainant has, which is what holds them back from choosing to file a police complaint. That is also very different when you come to the internal committee. One, the internal committee is made up of people that the employee is familiar with, the employee trusts. So it is a much safer space to choose to share such sensitive information. Additionally, internal committee members are trained to not ask questions which are moral, like moral judgment. So no questions about, oh, why were you drinking so late in the night? Or why were you wearing a short skirt? None of these questions are useful when somebody chooses to file a complaint. And the internal committee is only focused on the facts of the case, not making any moral judgment. The second, like Ishani mentioned, it is a very confidential process. So besides the committee members and maybe one of the directors of the organization who has to implement the corrective action, nobody else has access to the details of the complaint. And lastly, I think employees also see that if they choose to file a complaint with the IC, it is much more time bound. It's a much faster process. If I choose to go to court, I don't know if my case will take 5 years, 10 years, or forever. But if I file a complaint with the internal committee, I know that within 3 months, there will be some conclusion. So we often say that the internal committee complaints are faster, they are safer, and more importantly, it's free from any kinds of moral judgment. So people automatically feel more secure reaching out to the committee rather than filing externally.
Definitely, Chryslynn. Yeah, I completely agree with that. All right. So Ishani, you have already explained us in a very wonderful way about the role of HR in implementing the PoSH policy in the organization. Now, I'll slightly extend this question. And the question is, what is the role of leaders in creating a safe working environment?
So once again, this is also something that we have seen goes a long way. So I'll give you a few examples of some of the startups that we work with. We started working with them when there were 10 people, right? And the law says that as soon as you are 10 employees, you should implement the PoSH law, which means the 5 mandates of the law. So whether you have a female employee or not, as soon as you hit the number 10, you need to start, otherwise you won't be compliant. So we had implemented, the PoSH Act with companies which are now unicorns, but they were as small as 10 employees. And the founders used to sit in those sessions, and they continued to do so for the next 4 or 5 years as they grew bigger, because of the signal it sends, right? If your employees see that this is something I'm not afraid to talk about, however difficult the words are. So we have gone into, we have done sessions with companies where people are not even used to using the word sexual harassment. They will say that thing that you talked about. So they would not even directly say the word sexual harassment. But once a leader is present there, they're openly talking about it. They're asking questions which are difficult questions. Say, for example, what happens if confidentiality is broken? These kind of questions, if the leader is sitting there and asking, that goes a long way of showing that they believe in it. They believe in zero tolerance. So if anything happens, then the management will actually stand by them. Now, how can they stand by them? So one of the things they can do is by ensuring that they take up any case of sexual harassment, however small or big it is, right? So the, say for example, the committee recommends that such and such action needs to be taken. A termination needs to happen. It has been very impactful on the complainant and the organization, the sexual harassment. So a termination has to happen. Now, leadership should not come and say that, no, I don't think termination should happen. You should relook at this. That is not what they should do. They should trust the IC to say that you have looked at the evidences, you have spoken to the witnesses, you have spoken to both the complainant and the perpetrator. I trust your judgment. I trust that what you are recommending, I will do that, right? That is what says the commitment from the leadership. Second way they can commit to it is the law says, help out the complainant in filing a police complaint if they choose to do so. So one kind of situation like this arise is physical harassment. For example, somebody has faced sexual assault, and we have dealt with cases of physical sexual harassment in the workplace as well. Now, it's a choice of the complainant that would they like to file a complaint. Now, if they would like to file a police complaint, what the leadership can do is actually help them out. Say, for example, they have in-house lawyers. The lawyer can help in writing the FIR, for example, the complaint to the police. If they don't have an in-house lawyer, what they can do is be physically present, help them out, morally help them out when the police complaint is being filed. Now, all of this depend on the leadership. And one of the other things that we have seen is leaders going above and beyond to support their employees when they go through something traumatic. Say, for example, cases of stalking, cases of repeated behavior of sexual harassment. Oftentimes, complainants go through a severe mental trauma. So, in that case, what the leadership can do is, say, for example, support them through counseling sessions. So, if they want to see somebody, seek help from somebody, they can actually, bear the cost of those counseling sessions. That really goes a long way for the complainant to not only feel safe, but they can come back to the workplace in a much better capacity when the case is over, for example. So once again, the commitment from the leadership goes really a long way, however small or a big company you are.
Absolutely, absolutely, Ishani. Thank you so much for sharing this information. And also, meantime, dear attendees, we are now heading towards the last question to our expert speaker. But before that, I would request you to start putting across your questions in the Q&A option of the Zoom control panel. We will be taking it soon in a while, right? Okay. So Chryslynn, this is the next question is, I can say, the most trending one. In fact, I personally is very much interested to know about this. So the question is, due to the pandemic, there is now a hybrid workspace, right? So many of us are working from home. So in such a scenario, how can PoSH be implemented in any organization?
So that's a great question, Rashmi. A lot of companies are in still mandatory work from home, and a lot of them are in the hybrid model. When the mandatory work from home also began, there were a lot of employee questions. People were facing subtle forms of sexual harassment, for example, on WhatsApp, virtually during meetings with videos on, things like that, right? But they were not sure, can I file a complaint or not, because I'm not in the office, I'm working from home. So one of the things we talk about is spreading that awareness during your trainings about what constitutes a workplace. A workplace is not just your registered office. It is every space that an employee is visiting for work. It can be a conference, it can be working from home. And today we don't only use one platform. Virtually, besides our company registered email address, we are using multiple platforms to communicate with employees, vendors, partners. So it's important to sort of spell out all of those spaces that would be considered as a workplace that people can then choose to file a complaint. The second thing I would suggest is, besides this one-time training that you're doing, it's important to have regular communications. So these communications from your IC can be in the form of mailers, which keep reiterating the company's stance, the company's commitment to employee well-being and employee safety. The other thing I will also say is that, especially in a hybrid model, if you are appointing committee members, often they remain a set of names on a policy document or a poster of, okay, these are my committee members. But if you have a town hall, if you have, say, every quarter or every 6 months a town hall where the employees get a chance to interact with these committee members, ask them questions, discuss things like company culture, it puts a face, it puts a familiar face to these names on your company policy. And that once again increases the chances of somebody reaching out for help and actually accessing the policy. The last thing that I will talk about is with regards to implementation during cases. So during a hybrid or a virtual hearing, some of the processes become a little challenging, right? And it's important to do an internal committee training that preps your committee members to conduct an investigation that is not just as per procedure, but also empathetic. If you're doing a virtual case hearing, for example, and the respondent has their camera on and all other IC members, some have it on, some have it off, it is a very intimidating experience for the respondent. So small practices like ensuring everybody's camera is on, ensuring that you're asking the respondent or the complainant, are you okay? Would you like to continue? Do you need a break? So even virtually, there are many cues in which we can ensure that the parties are feeling safe. So preparing your IC members for these virtual or hybrid case hearings is a very important part of PoSH implementation. So I think these are the four that we've seen to be quite important in the past few months.
Sure, Chryslynn. Thank you so much for sharing the information. So I think with this, we are done with the round. So I'll be moving on to the last part of our today's session, that is audience Q&A. So I think audience have started pouring across the questions. So pouring the questions here. So very first question, which is very basic, but it's also very important for all of us to know more about it. And the question is, what is included in sexual harassment?
Ishani, you want to take that or?
Yes, surely. So yes, there are three different ways the law covers sexual harassment. One is physical sexual harassment. So you can think of any uncomfortable touch, somebody, and all the way from say uncomfortable touch to sexual assault or even rape. So physical harassment can range from anything which is physical in nature. Right? Verbal harassment is the second type, which is, for example, somebody cracking a joke which is sexual in nature, somebody saying something to you which is has a sexual word with it, certain words, say for example certain profanities that are used which are actually sexual in nature, whether they're in English or in local language. So those, all those types of words also fall under verbal sexual harassment, right? Third way of thinking about it is the non-verbal or graphic sexual harassment. What do I mean by that? Like I talked about the meme or a joke that is sent on WhatsApp, for example. It can come to you as a text, it can come to you as a LinkedIn message, it can come to you as a Facebook message, on Instagram, any platform. But if anything gets written or as an image or something that is shown to you which has anything sexual or inappropriate in it, that can constitute as verbal or graphic sexual harassment. The two other ways of thinking about sexual harassment is power-based harassment, what is called quid pro quo. Quid pro quo means you give me this, I'll give you that. So say, for example, I'm in a position of a power and I say that I will only give you a promotion if you give me sexual favors, or I'll make sure that you do not get the promotion if you don't give me what I'm asking for. That is called quid pro quo or power-based harassment. There is also something called creating a hostile work environment, which means if a sexual harassment happens even outside the workplace, but happens to a person that is connected to the workplace, and there is an impact and it creates a hostile work environment, when they come back to work, the IC can look at it as well. So these are 5 different ways that we look at sexual harassment.
Wonderful. And that seems to be very interesting, Ishani. Thank you so much for sharing this piece of information. And I hope, dear attendee, the question is now answered. So one of our attendees have the next question for us. Chryslynn, maybe this question is for you. So the question is, which body can help us prepare gender neutral policies?
So largely, I mean, we at Serein, we write gender neutral company policies for all our partners. So technically, your external member should be assisting you with writing a gender neutral company policy. What you are doing is you're specifying that when I say gender neutral policy, it means that male, female, transgender, anybody can file a complaint against, once again, male, female, or transgender employee, right? So both sides, it is gender neutral. So that would need to be specified. Also, it's in accordance to the non-discrimination, that as a company, you are committed to a safe and inclusive workplace for all employees, and hence you are choosing to write a gender neutral company policy. So in your definition of who is a complainant, who is a respondent in your policy, that is largely where you're specifying these aspects.
Sure, Chryslynn. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you so much. And Ishani, this next question is for you. So one of our attendees wish to know if any of the internal committee members has left the company, and if they have sufficient numbers remaining in the company to meet the PoSH Act, can the IC continue as is, or should the committee be reconstituted?
Okay. So this is a very, very good question. What is the number of people you need to have in an IC? It has to be 5. So 4 internal members and 1 external member. So if you had more than 5 people on the IC and 1 person leaves the committee, then it's okay to continue on as long as you have 5 people. During an inquiry, the quorum is 3. That means always during an inquiry, the presiding officer plus 2 people need to be present during every single conversation. But to form an IC and continue on with an IC, you need to have 5 members always. So if you say, for example, you had 5 to begin with and one person has left, now you're down to 4, you don't have to reconstitute an IC, you have to nominate a new member. You have to only reconstitute an IC once the 3-year tenure is over, and that's when the law says that you form a new committee. So until then, if you are less in number, get a new person on board. After you have crossed 3 years, get a new committee.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ishani. And I think that answers our next question as well from our attendee. So the question is there any minimum and maximum limit to appoint members in internal committee? So I'm guessing that Ishani, the answer remains same here. Is there anything that you would like to add?
So minimum members, sometimes people do take it as 4 members, which means 3 people internally and 4th person would be external. These are for very, very small companies when you do not have enough female members, for example. But once you have crossed 20 members, for example, don't have a 4-member IC, have a 5-member IC.
All right, so I think that helps a lot. Thank you so much, Ishani. So I think next question is for Chryslynn. So Chryslynn, the question is, one of our attendees just want to ensure that their understanding is right. So the question is, PoSH is mandatory if company has female employees, but not mandatory yet good to have if all employees are male. Am I right?
Unfortunately, no. The law says that any company with more than 10 employees is expected to implement PoSH. This is because that you might presently have 10 male employees, but the law also covers other people associated with your organization, which means that tomorrow, say you have female clients or customers, you have a female vendor or a third party, and if they face sexual harassment from one of your employees, your internal committee would have to conduct that investigation and take action. Hence, it is important that regardless of the internal gender composition, the moment you cross 10 employees, you're expected to implement PoSH.
All right, so I hope that answers the question. Thank you, Chryslynn. So the next question is, I think Dr. Ishani can take this up. So the question is it mandate to have a IC member from NGO or Serein legal, senior legal female advocate can also be the into committee member? Please advise.
This is a very, very good question. So the law does not require neither an NGO nor a legal expert. So what it says is you need to have somebody who is expertise in gender, as per say. So you don't have to have somebody from an NGO. It's okay to have somebody who is a senior legal advocate, but there are 2 things to keep in mind. That senior legal advocate cannot have another contract with the organization, right? They cannot be, say, for example, taking care of your employment law and other things. That will be a direct conflict of interest, because in that case, you are actually working with the management, so will not be seen as a fair and unbiased person. So another way of looking at the law is it's great to have a lawyer, but like Chryslynn said, expertise in gender actually goes a long way as well. Because say, for example, tomorrow a male member comes and says that, I've been feeling very uncomfortable by some of the situations I have been noticing. Then it's very important for somebody who knows gender to answer those questions with empathy, right? Tomorrow you hire a transgender employee, then it's really important for you to know that what are the kind of situations they may face, what kind of verbal harassment, what kind of discrimination they may face, so you can take it along with empathy.
Sure. Thanks for answering this, Ishani. And Chryslynn, the next question that one of our attendees would like to know from you, who can be included as external member in the IC?
Oh, so very similar to what Ishani said, to sort of pick an external member who has an expertise in gender. and largely somebody who's familiar with the law. So one is to have somebody who understands the procedures, who has some experience of dealing with cases. And when I say an understanding of gender, to look at gender slightly from the broader sense. Today, a lot, in fact, of our partners are hiring people from the transgender community. And often these employees from the LGBTQ community can face acts of bullying and discrimination, which are also forms of sexual harassment. So to have an external member who has that expertise will help you with the process and implementing this gender neutral policy that you have in place.
Sure. I hope that answers the question. So, Ishani, the next question is, the company is having PoSH policy. So is it required to mention in employment agreement, or if we mention employee handbook, will it be okay?
Oh, this is a great question. So typically, yes, it is mentioned in the employee handbook, as long as the employee is reading the employee handbook and, make sure they're understanding, that is fine. I have actually had one of my contracts which mentioned in my employment contract saying that we are a zero tolerance company. And that kind of gave me some sort of confidence in the company while I was actually coming in. So it's actually a great practice. If you want to put it in the contract saying you're a zero tolerance company, why not? But having it as part of the induction material is also okay.
Sure. I hope that answers the question. Thanks, Ishani. So, Chryslynn, the next question, our attendee would like to know it from you. The attendee says, Ms. Chryslynn talked about maintaining proper documentation by IC during the investigation process. So what should this include?
Sure. So, as per the letter of the law, all your meetings have to be recorded. Now, largely when you are doing a case inquiry, you would do an audio recording, but it doesn't end there. You have to also transcribe those recordings, and that is the documentation. Besides that, you will also be issuing letters, say, for example, confidentiality letters to the complainant, the witnesses, the respondent. You will also issue out a response to the complainant or a statement of allegations to the respondent. All of these have to be documented and kept in a confidential folder. When you are transcribing the minutes of a meeting, for example, you have to get it signed by all the parties who are present at that meeting. So say, for example, we are conducting the investigation of the respondent and there are 3 IC members present. All those 3 IC members and the respondent have to sign that final transcription. So it is important because tomorrow, like I said earlier, if a case goes to court, it is the committee's report that the judge is going to refer back to. And it is important to have a complete documentation of all the communication back and forth with all of the parties. What was the minutes of these different meetings that you conducted? And minutes is not a summary of the meeting, it is largely the transcription. So verbatim what was said in that meeting. So that is the extent of documentation required.
All right, so I hope that answers the question. Thanks, Chryslynn. So dear attendees, we can see a lot of questions are coming in. We are trying our best to take up all your questions, but due to interest of time, if you are not able to answer your questions, please don't be disappointed. We will definitely get back to you with the responses. All right. In the meantime, I'll just go to the next question. Ishani, if you can help us answer this. The question is, what are the remedies available if the witness has given false evidence?
This is a very good question. There is actually a penalty for false evidence. The company can actually take a disciplinary action against the witnesses who give false evidence. I know there is an interest of time, but there is a very good question if you want Chryslynn to take it. It's from an anonymous attendee. It's a great question, actually. It says that, is it necessary to say no to a behavior by a complainant before they reach out to the committee? So if you want to hear it from Chryslynn, I would love to.
That's actually a very good question. Thanks, Ishani. Honestly, that's a question we get asked at all of our employee trainings, that shouldn't the person have said no first? That is the very reason you have an internal committee. because the law acknowledges that saying no is not easy at all, and you require the intervention of a set of people who are trained. So we actually did a study. So like Ishani mentioned, we work with a lot of different companies across sectors, and we did a study to find this particular answer out. We wanted to see that, so we asked a couple of questions. We were studying bystander intervention, and we wanted to see how likely is somebody to say no or confront the harasser directly if they are the ones facing sexual harassment. We had over 400 data points, and across organizations, people said that they were extremely uncomfortable to directly confront the harassment. However, a lot of participants said if they are a third party observing the harassment, they might say something, right? But that still was not an overwhelming yes. Now, the thing to remember is traditionally, as a society, we are trained to say yes. We are trained to not make other people uncomfortable, right? What do we tell children as they are growing up? That if you have, say, guest coming over, what do we tell children? Sing for uncle, sing for auntie, right? Now, what does the child say? I don't want to sing. I'm feeling shy. I'm feeling uncomfortable. What do we tell the child? No, 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 you have to sing. You have to do this. So over time, we have grown up to silence our understanding of consent, our understanding of boundaries. So when somebody violates those boundaries in a workplace, it is even more difficult for us as adults to say no. So one of the things that we suggest as HR, as IC members is, yes, you can empower people to say no, but it is going to take a very long time before people actually do that. More importantly, and there is a lot of research around this, instead of empowering people to say no, empower employees to be what we call active bystanders, which means that teach your employees, if you observe harassment, if you witness harassment, it is your responsibility to either forward it to the internal committee or to say something in that moment. So forcing an employee to say no, the person facing the harassment, is not a practical way forward, but more practical would be to empower a bystander to say something in that instance. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sure. Thanks so much, Chryslynn. Yeah. And also in the meantime, I'll just take a couple of more questions and then end the session. Ishani, probably you can answer this question. So the question is how to file annual report, and is there any particular format that has to be used?
Yes, absolutely. So the annual report filing, like I mentioned, if the annual report goes to the district officer, right? They can be different people depending on which location you are. In a city, for example, they can be deputy commissioner, they can be the magistrate also, but it depends on where you are. So the state of Bangalore, who the district officer who is authorized to take the annual report is going to be very different from in Delhi. But there is an authority that it needs to be filed by the first week of January. So there is a particular format also to file the annual report. Basically, what they need to know is no confidential information. Do not put the details of a case, for example, but you need to let people know that you have formed a committee. There are certain awareness trainings have been done. Those need to go in. If there have been cases, those need to go in. So there is a particular format to do that as well.
All right, so I hope that answers the question. Thanks, Ishani. And Chryslynn, maybe if you can help us with the next question. The question is, when is the due date of filing PoSH return?
So like Ishani mentioned, it's not financial year, it is Jan to December. So what we say is the annual report has to go post 31st of December. So the first week of Jan is the ideal time to file your annual report. So first is typically a holiday. So between 2nd to say 4th or 5th is largely when you should go ahead and file your report.
All right, thanks for the answer. So I think I'll just take two more questions and then end the session. So the next question is, since we talk about hybrid workspace, I think this question has come up from there. So the question is how an IC would be formed in a co-working space. So Ishani, if you can help us with this.
This is a very, very good question. So what happens in a co-working space? Now, co-working space have different places, offices, there are registered companies, right? As long as they are over 10 employees, they have to have their own PoSH committees. If there's less than 10 employees, there's something called the local complaints committee where the complaint goes to. But the co-working space itself is actually a registered company. So they need to have their own IC committee as well. So in that case, say for example, I'll give you an example, it'll be clear. If I am an employee of a company A, and I'm working out of co-working space B, and I face harassment from another company C, working also out of co-working space B, then I have 3 places I can go to, actually 4, which is my own committee. I can also file a complaint to the perpetrators committee, which is company C. I can also go to company B, which is the co-working committee, right? And also can go to the local complaints committee, which is formed by the government.
All right. Yeah, that gives a lot of clarification, Ishani. Thank you so much. So one last question for the day. So the question is, Chryslynn, maybe if you can help us answer this. So the question is, how do we conduct training for IC and who is qualified to train the IC members?
So I would recommend having an expert train your committee. Also train employees. Very often, a lot of organizations do try and do these trainings internally, but I strongly, and I mean, largely as a company, we strongly recommend having a person who's an expert in the law. You will see when you do a PoSH training, people don't only want to know what is sexual harassment, they also want to understand the procedure. If I choose to file a complaint, what are going to be the processes? What are the chances of the complaint backfiring, for example? Or what are the technicalities, say, if there is a breach of confidentiality? So when your training covers all of these technical aspects as well, 2 things happen. 1, your employees feel more empowered, and 2, they begin to trust the internal committee better. If I'm an employee in an organization, I want to know that I can trust the committee, but also that my committee has the expertise to deal with the case. So one of our recommendations is to always have an expert take your training for employees and IC members. Do the training regularly for IC members. One of the things is mentioned in the law that every year, all employees as well as all IC members have to undergo the training. This means that if your employees have done the training last year, legally they still have to do the training once again this year, because it serves as a refresher so that people know 2 things: what is sexual harassment, but more importantly, what is the redressal process available in your company and how do they reach out for help. So 1 is definitely have an expert come in, and 2, do it, space it over time, right? Have a committee go through some advanced learning. So the law also says training, but capacity building of committee members. So they are fully aware of not just the law, but the interpretation of it. What are the different kinds of cases? So for example, like we discussed, right? The definition of a workplace is not just your registered office. In our experience, majority of cases, for example, happen outside the workplace, when people are going for a conference, when people are meeting up for a movie. Now, if your IC is trained on a regular basis, they're able to better understand these different aspects of sexual harassment and how to take it up when technically you might feel like, okay, it doesn't fall under my jurisdiction, right? So definitely do the trainings more often and do it by an expert. That would be our recommendation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chryslynn. So I think with this, we have reached the end of our session. But before I conclude and end the session, I would like to thank you, all of you, for making this session a grand success. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Ishani and Ms. Chryslynn for taking out the time out of their busy schedule and for making themselves available for the session here. I'm sure the information they have shared with all of us today was very insightful and will definitely benefit our attendees. Thank you so much again. And also, dear attendees, thank you for attending this session again, and we'll be looking forward to see you in our upcoming sessions. So on this note, like I said again, if you have missed out on any part of our session, do not worry. The session recording will be shared with all of you. And if any of your questions are unanswered, again, do not worry, you will get the responses for all of them soon from Great HR. So thank you so much, and see you again in our upcoming sessions. Till then, stay safe, take care. have a great time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi. Lovely to meet you, and thank you so much for having us.
Same here, same
Thank you, Rashmi. You're a lovely host.
here. Thank you so much, Ishani.
Have a nice evening. Bye bye.
Bye.